Good morning. Welcome to the Point. Last week in this show, you saw a debate between the Republican and Democratic candidates for governor. The only other primary ballot qualified candidate is Bill Gelineau of the Libertarian Party. This morning, we talk with him. Let's talk about this race in the final stages. You and I have talked over the years about this prospect of libertarians and being on the ballot and trying to break through in a two-party system, which is a difficult thing to do. But this year, you were on the primary ballot for the first time, so that's a big step. Where are we? Where are you as we approach the final weeks?
Well, as you know, there are 6 parties on the ballot, and we are really the big kid among those. The other 3 parties, the people who are running for governor together have raised about $1,800, all 3 of them together. Whereas we've raised $85,000, pushing toward $100,000. We have billboards up, we have ads we're running. So, the fact that there is this diffusing of opposition really makes creating a third party much more difficult, and we recognize that. But having invested as we have and having the infrastructure that we have, which really puts us in a class by ourselves, as you know, we qualified as a major party, but that hasn't always meant a lot. You've been very generous, but certainly some of the other media, it's been much more difficult. But we're not displeased. We think that we've got a genuine shot at breaking through and doing something that's never been done in the state.
When you think about some of the things that interest you, and again, we've had these conversations, we were just talking about some of the issues that are not necessarily roads or infrastructure or what's going to happen with fresh water, but there are other things that interest you as well, not that you aren't interested in all of that.
Sure.
We've talked about that. You were talking about child protective services, and you were also talking about parenting and laws that are currently being considered. You talk about that with passion. Talk to me about where, first of all, one of the House bills, I think it's the House bill that you were talking about. Yep. Talk to me about that bill, what it means, and why you think it's important.
Well, appreciate that. First of all, with regard to all those other issues that we've certainly discussed before, I encourage people to go to my website, which is cometogethermichigan.org, and we talk about the environment and roads and all those things extensively. I think one of the areas that we're going to really make some headway is working with some of the interest groups that have things that are in the legislature. One in particular, I believe House Bill 4691, which is the Michigan Shared Parenting Act, something that affects an awful lot of people. Many people in our state have gone through divorce, and I think one of the things that we've looked at is what are the things that the law should do in terms of treating people equally and providing a circumstance where when parents do go through that they still have that opportunity to raise their kids. And I think that's a really, really important issue.
How does that, how would that impact what's going on now? I mean, because I don't know precisely how that works, to be sure, but in many cases of people that I am familiar with, they do, to some degree, have shared parenting. What would this do to change that?
Well, it's going to give instruction to the court to say that there's a presumption that all things being equal. Now, again, there's a set aside for, if there's domestic violence or some other things that would negate the parent's equal right. But it's not only the time having the idea of shared parenting, but shared time where they're equally responsible for time with the children so that they've got the real opportunity to be a parent in a very real way, as opposed to what we call shared custody, where the idea is that they're going to have access all the time.
Every other weekend.
Exactly, yeah. And so an awful lot of people have recognized that you can't be a real parent unless you can invest the kind of time that's necessary to be that parent. And that's certainly one of the issues that I think is really important.
You mentioned Child Protective Services. I get tons of email on a regular basis, and one of the reasons that it is a difficult subject to broach is because each of those emails is about an individual case.
Absolutely.
And so as an individual case, it's hard to look at it as the broader spectrum. But talk to me about your view of CPS and the impact it has on families across the state.
Well, I know people personally who have been through Child Protective Services, and you may be aware of the Binsfield provisions, which were passed by former Representative and Lieutenant Governor Connie Binsfield. And Michigan, actually, it's easier to break a parent's rights and sever those rights permanently in Michigan than any other state in the union. And so I've pledged to put a board together to review that and come back to figure out why it is that we are so quick to take parental rights away. And sometimes these are working in conjunction with a criminal possible trial, and we know how often in criminal proceedings where charges can be overcharged as a lever. And these two things working together have created an awful lot of chaos. We have more kids as a per capita in Michigan than almost any other state in the union. It is something that it's an incredibly large problem. I would use the word industry because there is a certain presumption that often goes on in the law, and it's something I'm really concerned about.
What do you do, because as a state and as an agency, when you let one child slip through the cracks, and we've seen that happen, that becomes a huge firestorm, as I believe it should. So while you want these children to be protected, how do you protect parents' rights and balance that with children's rights, particularly when you know when something disastrous happens to a child? The first question is, well, why didn't you catch that in the first place?
You bet, and it is often a no-win scenario for the government as well. But I do think it's something that, as we've started to see the trends develop over the last 30 years, I think it's worthy of review and much broader discussion. A lot of academics are talking about it, but I don't hear a lot of politicians talking about it. And I think that's one of the reasons is that they're afraid to touch it, because it does require a lot of thought and a lot of work. But it's something that's certainly come to my attention. You mentioned how many emails you get about it. And so I think it's something that I want to pledge to the voters that if given the opportunity to serve, that I would put a board together to review these procedures and see what we need to do to tighten those things up.
For a decade and a half, we've had military men and women dispatched all over. Not that we haven't beyond that, but actually in active fighting positions. Some of that has been lessened over the past couple of years, but there are thousands and thousands of military men and women who are coming back to this country after their service abroad, and they need services that are available if you know how to access them. You were telling me a story about a friend of yours who said, look, these services are there, but if you can't get to them, they might as well not be. And you have an interest, if you were successful in this race, to do something about that.
Well, as you know, I've talked about areas of the government that I think we can really do a lot of savings. But one of the things that I would want to prioritize in terms of money is making sure that our veteran service officers, that we get enough accredited people in every county so that when people need to manage those services, that they can actually access them. And right now, that's very difficult. They've put a lot of these services online, and in an aging population, there's an awful lot of people who may not be as familiar, who are 75 years old, with how to even use the internet.
And there you're talking about Vietnam veterans, perhaps.
You bet. And so having that ombudsman step into that, I think, is a really important thing to do, and there's not enough people talking about that. And so these are some of the very specific issues that I've tried to bring out in my campaign, and I'm finding on the trail that there's an awful lot of people that are interested in them.
Talk to me about this process, because you have been involved with the Libertarians for as long as I've been covering politics here in the state of Michigan. Yet the political environment has changed, not just because you were on the primary ballot. It's certainly a big step, but it's changed because there is increasing angst about what's going on largely in Washington, but certainly here in Michigan as well. And Republicans and Democrats blame each other, and voters sometimes look at Republicans and Democrats and say, well, wait a minute, I don't know if I see an answer there. Still, as you've talked about, it's difficult to break through as another idea. So over the course of this year that you've been doing this, what have you found? What is different out there from your perspective when you look at this election?
Well, I think, we've had all the same problems that we've seen in the past, and the whole idea of wasting your vote and all that. And an issue that I've always believed in, but I guess I've really brought to the forefront, is ranked choice voting. And I believe that that is going to be the long-term answer that's going to allow minor parties, and it's a process that probably can't be explained quickly.
Right.
I encourage people to go to fairvote.org, because the state of Maine is now using it, and it allows people to vote more than once in the same election. It's very interesting how it's done, and it's really about building consensus. And what it assures is that whenever there's a candidate that doesn't get 50%, which is what happened in Michigan in 2016, that the votes of eliminated candidates would be able to be recast and eventually build a consensus. I think that ranked choice voting not only is going to change the electoral paradigm, but it's also going to change the conversation.
When we come back, another of those important state Senate races that we'll be watching on an election night. That's next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. In addition to some really big races this year for governor and U.S. Senate, every single seat in the legislature is up for a vote. We'll be watching those too, particularly some of those state Senate seats like the one in the 20th District. That's where incumbent Margaret O'Brien, who won by 61 votes 4 years ago, faces the very same field again with her Democratic challenger Sean McCann and a Libertarian candidate Lawrence Winkie. You'll hear from all three of them right now as we take a look at the 20th Senate District. Senator, let's start with the why. You've been in Lansing, you served in the House, you've got one term under your belt in the Senate, you're running again. I ask people this, and I don't do it even tongue-in-cheek, but I'm very serious about why people choose to run in this environment. Politics today is much different than it was when I first started covering it, and certainly different than it was even when you started participating. What motivates you to run?
Politics has gotten very nasty, and so what motivates me is my community. I have been able to cross those party lines and deliver on tough issues. And I think more now than ever, we need people who aren't partisan, who don't engage in that nasty, rude rhetoric. We need real solutions that are handled by people. And my legislative career has been one of those.
When you look at the issues that face the state, they're different, again, than they were when you first started. The economy in the state, the economy of the nation has certainly taken a turnaround in the last 10 years. But within the state, there are still people who aren't participating in that economic recovery. There are jobs that go unfilled because we don't have the skills. There are still infrastructure issues. So what are some of the things that if you're reelected, you'd like to focus on?
There's a lot of issues that we need to work for. You know, number one in my community is safe, clean drinking water. We have had PFAS, we've had dioxins. There have been a number of challenges, and we need to first and foremost make sure our drinking water is safe. Second, we really need to clean up these contaminated sites that have been abandoned. For too long, they've just been sitting there, and now as we look to see where all these sources of problems are in my community and throughout the state, a lot of it is abandoned brownfield sites. We have to do more. Next, we also need to address those people who've been left behind. They haven't experienced the prosperity. And so we need to make sure that we're letting students know they have many options, and vocational jobs are great. You know, being a pipe fitter, an electrician, an HVAC person, you can do it regardless of your sex or your race. Those jobs are available. But we also need to look at our retirees. And over the last couple of years, I've been listening to some of their concerns. And I think now's the time to make permanent the exemptions that had been put in forth when we tried to make sure all retiree income was treated the same. I think it's time to make it permanent and have an exemption, $30,000 a person, $60,000 a couple, so that retirees know there's a certain portion of their income that will never be taxed.
If you do that, what kind of an economic impact does it have on the budget?
You know, that's what we're looking at. It would be very easy to have introduced this by now, but we know the hurdles are real, and I've always cared about how do you get good public policy across the finish line. So right now we're running some of those numbers because I don't want to introduce a bill to go win a vote. I want to introduce a bill to actually have a solution, and part of that solution is about making sure I've addressed all the concerns like the impact on the budget and fairness amongst income. I want to make sure I've addressed everyone's concerns, and so we're still working on that.
We're going to hear a lot about roads during this election cycle. I've heard a lot about roads since I've been covering politics in Michigan. People have been complaining about them even before that. You and the legislature came up with a plan, you passed it, there's more money in the system, and people are still complaining about the roads, and they'll be complaining about the roads in 5 years. But where are we on infrastructure, at least above ground?
We are improving. We have spent $2.3 additional billion over the last 2.5 years. And so we have done a lot, and we're going to keep doing a lot. And as much as we love to complain about roads, we love to complain about orange barrels. So we're going to keep the construction on high gear. We're going to keep putting more money into roads. And in Kalamazoo County, we got an extra $5 million just for this construction season. And I think that's how, when you can advocate for your community and show real needs, you can get real results. But in addition to roads, now is the time we also have to reform auto no fault, because that is the number one issue. Roads being number two. Number one is our high insurance rates. And Michigan is the highest in the country when it comes to automobile insurance. I have voted 6 times to reform it, and I am tired of us not being able to get that across the finish line.
Let's talk about this process. You're no stranger to running for office, served in the House of Representatives. Actually, everybody running in this cycle has served in the House of Representatives. Right. And this is an interesting election year. We were just talking about that off the air. It might keep somebody out of the arena because politics has gotten pretty harsh. So why did you decide to run this year?
Well, a lot of things came into our thought process. I think it was a post-2016 process where we look at what happened in Michigan and across the country. Also what the administration of the last now 8 years has brought in terms of Michigan's administration. And that motivated me, and my family agreed that we needed to make a difference somehow. I was very interested in the gerrymandering reform proposal, and I was super excited to see how that got up and moving, and it's now on the ballot. But for me it was direction of the country, direction of our state, not anywhere in the direction we think it needs to go in. So I'm in to give it another try and see where voters are going to land on Election Day.
Well, let's talk about a couple of those things. Talk about the direction of the state. And over the past 8 years, the overall economy in the country, and certainly in Michigan, have gotten much, much better. There would be some elected officials who would take credit for that. I presume that you would not give them credit for that, but tell me about the direction in the past 8 years that concerns you.
Yeah, that's very true. I think that's kind of been a top sentiment in my mind, is really people trying to take credit for things that they maybe didn't create, and also is there an economy that is taking care of everyone. But for me, the direction of the state primarily is, where are our schools at? Where are our roads at? Are we expanding health care and taking care of people in Michigan? Those are the top drivers for me, and I think those are clear things to look at when you look at the last 8 years. Crumbling roads, schools that are still sending me home flyers with my kids that say we need supplies, books, paper, pencils, and whether or not Michigan is going to continue to take care of citizens with health care.
Well, one of the things when you talk about, particularly when you talk about roads, the question there is how much money and how quickly can you spend that money that it's going to make a difference. What should we be doing from your perspective with roads, given that there was an infusion of more money into the Department of Transportation, and that money is starting now to finally get up to speed. We have seen a lot of road projects, but as you accurately point out, the overall condition of roads has not gotten better.
Yeah, I think both the infusion and the coming online of those funds, although it represented tax increases on Michigan citizens when other tax dollars and tax rebates were offered to other sectors of the economy, is going to help address the problem, but it's very late in the process. And what I know from my experience at the local city commissioner level, 10 years, is that when you let infrastructure fall behind, it costs you more over the long run. So we're going to pay higher costs. We're not going to get as much roads repaired and bridges as we want to. And now we're layering in problems of neglected water health and caretaking with our water. So, pile Flint on top of that, and what that's cost taxpayers, a very pound foolish, penny wise approach. I think that overall we're not seeing the kind of infrastructure that we deserve, and it doesn't serve a growing economy.
What you talk about when you talk about roads in Michigan, I don't know what the dollar figure is that it takes to fix them. I know that the governor's task force looking at underground infrastructure, water, sewer, and other things, is more than $4 billion. And people say, well, you have a $58 billion budget, but as you know, that money is not easily spent. Much of that is pass-through money. So if money is part of the equation, where does that have to come from?
Well, it's coming. There's the tax dollars that were raised, and there may need to be other ways that we look at this. Some money may come from what happens with the decriminalization of cannabis on the ballot. There may be ways to change budget priorities so that we invest even more in infrastructure, especially as it relates to water. But I've been on the Appropriations Committee. I know how state budgets can be changed and how we can find resources, and I think there's a lot of options there.
Let's talk a little bit about your motivation, because you've served in the State House of Representatives, you've run for this office before. Why is it important for you to seek office this year?
I still have many issues that are very important to me. I still want to talk about those issues. I want to try to move them along through the legislative process. They're important to me, and it could very well take years and years and years for these things to change. but they need to be changed, and I'd like to work on several issues that I've written out, passed out, they're important to me.
Let's talk about some of this. You know, when people run for office, they do have specific things in mind, and I think it's instructive to find out from the candidate what those are. So talk to me about some of the things that you would like to try to affect change.
The number one issue for me, and the reason I left the Republican Party 4 years ago, is to fight for equal rights for our gay family members. A lot has been done, a lot of successes have happened, but we still need to amend the Elliott-Larsen Act. Right now it is legal in Michigan to fire someone as an employee because of their LGBTQ status. It's legal to deny housing to people because of their LGBTQ status. That should be changed. The Republicans haven't changed it. I don't think they will, and we need to keep pressure on them to get that issue changed.
Well, one of the things that would take would be a vote in both legislative bodies. So obviously you're seeking office, you would try to move the Senate in that direction. How do you convince people to make that change? Because the request has been made in the past to have a legal ruling made, but it has to be done by the legislature.
Yeah, the culture on those issues is changing across the nation and across the world, so this process is happening, but it needs to be pushed along a little bit. We do not want a governor who's been on record as being against reforming the Elliott-Larsen Act. The legislature, the Senate's been in control of Republicans for 34 years. I think citizens should know that, and they should think about that when they vote, as if they want more equal treatment, more legislation friendly to their gay family members.
Beyond that, there are a lot of things in the state that are current issues that were issues when you were in office before. And one of the things that comes to mind is roads. And we know, just driving out here to your greenhouse today, we came through some very good roads that appear to be recently maintained, and some roads that could use some work. And that's pretty much the case all over the state. What should we be doing about that?
In the business that you're standing in right now, we put these flowers on racks and we bounce them down the highway from here to Atlanta, Georgia. Is not unusual, and they get damaged in the process of going down these bumpy roads. And I'm sure I'm just one of hundreds of businesses that experience damage with their product on roads in Michigan. We need to fix them. It's going to take money to fix them. Anybody who thinks they can do it through budget cuts or finding inefficiencies is just simply not telling a truthful story. We're going to have to raise taxes on people who use the roads to get them fixed, and I certainly would be a proponent of doing that.
So when you talk about people that use the road, are you talking about mileage taxes or some other way of taxing people that are using the road, or blanket across the board?
No, just the same taxes that we have now on fuel, on license plates, registration. That's how we tax people who use the roads now. I can't see any reason for any new tax plans. Just we're going to have to increase those taxes if we want better roads. And unfortunately, when the ballot issue was on the ballot a couple of years ago, it was such a confusing mishmash of choices that the public really didn't get a chance to vote on that. I'm quite sure the Michigan voters would vote for a tax on themselves to fix the roads if that's the only option that we have.
We'll be back with more To the Point. In 2 weeks and 2 days, we'll know the outcome of this election cycle. Next week, we'll take a look at two important Senate seats from the 29th and 34th District. We'll profile those races and continue to talk about what hinges on this big election day that's coming up. I hope you'll join us next Sunday morning. To the Point.